So do you want to tell us a little bit about these victims? Because I know that we have the 5 canonical victims. Everyone kind of agrees that these are the victims of Jack the Ripper. But if we add in all the other people that are supposedly his victims, that number rises to around 19, which is a huge number of victims. But these 5 canonical ones, we kind of want to focus on them, I think.
Yeah, 100%, especially because the other 19, you don't know if, who's to say there weren't multiple Jack the Rippers going around at that time.
Yeah.
So at least these 5 we definitely know about. So I'll just share the 5 names first and then give you a little bit of background on each of them. So we've got Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. So Mary Ann Nichols was a Londoner born in 1845. She and her husband had 5 children, but separated around 1881 for disputed reasons. People suspected that her husband had an affair, but he claimed the marriage ended because of alcoholism.
Right.
After their split, she took up jobs in workhouses and as a maidservant, but neither lasted long. Eventually, she turned to prostitution to make ends meet. It's very interesting that she was married and had children, because I think typically the association with these victims is that they were prostitutes, they were no good. And I think it's really important to change that narrative. And to show
I think that's
that
really true.
Yeah, that she was doing it just to look after her family.
Absolutely. And it's interesting as well when you look at some of the press reports from the time, because some of these people were, the reporters were saying that these people were living miserable and useless lives, which is really sad to think about. And that is the kind of common perception of these people. So like you say, it's very interesting that she was quite different to that.
Yeah. So just after midnight on the 31st of August, 1888, Mary Ann walked out into the night, hoping to earn the money to pay for the bed for the evening. After the discovery of her body the next day, investigators linked her murder to that of 2 other women that had previously been killed in the area in April and at the start of August. However, by the time of the inquest into her murder, another woman had been brutally killed in the same fashion.
Wow.
Investigators quickly concluded that Mary Ann's killer was not likely to be the culprit for the previous 2 murders, but was absolutely the assailant of Annie Chapman, murdered just 8 days after Mary Ann.
Wow, he's moving quickly, whoever this murderer was.
100%, 8 days as well. So let's get straight on to Annie Chapman. So Eliza Ann Smith, nicknamed Annie, was born in London, likely in 1840. So I think it's also interesting that her and Mary were about the same age.
Only 5 years apart.
So, not to fetishize it, but it seems the killer has a type thus far.
Yeah.
So she married John Chapman in 1869, and the couple had 3 children. After the death of their daughter, Annie and John both took to drinking heavily, and their marriage collapsed. So another married woman, previously married woman. So Annie moved to Whitechapel and lived on and off with 2 men. She made money through crochet work and flower selling, and subsidized this by occasional prostitution. I think this is another really important point, that prostitution was a substitute. And this was often the way during this period, that women would do it when they needed to, when they couldn't find other work. It wasn't their line of work, all the time. Yeah. And we'll be talking about this in the harlot episode that's yet to come further down the season. So at 1:45 on the 8th of September, 1888, Annie went out to earn money, as we've just said, and she was last seen around 5:30 a.m. in the morning speaking to an unidentified man. Her mutilated body was discovered in the public backyard of a house on Dorset Street. The similarity of her murder matched the attack on Mary Ann Nichols, and investigators immediately realised that the crimes were committed by the same assailant. Their frantic investigation picked up the pace, but another woman would be murdered by the same killer just a few weeks later.
Wow. It's interesting to look at the similarities between these first 2 murders, because both of them went out at night to get some money to pay for their lodging for that night. And then they both don't make it back, which is
terrible.
Very interesting.
It makes you wonder as well whether the murderer had perhaps a moral stance to it, maybe that he disagreed with that, or maybe he was just an opportunist. And I think the big mystery is that we will never know. We will never know.
Exactly.
So Elizabeth Gustavsdotter was born in 1843 in Torslanda, Sweden. Again, after a failed marriage, Elizabeth took to prostitution and was picked up multiple times by the Swedish police. In 1869, she moved to London, where she married John Stride, and the two had multiple children, although the exact number is still disputed. By 1881, they had separated, and Elizabeth took up with a local man named Michael Kidney. Throughout their on and off relationships, used sewing, house cleaning, and prostitution to support herself. On the evening of the 29th of September, 1888, Elizabeth was out with a man, potentially a client, near Berners Street in Whitechapel. Around 1 a.m. the next morning, her body was found in a stable yard, Dutfield's Yard, behind the Workers' Club on Berners Street. She had been murdered by a slash of the neck, although her body had been left undisturbed aside from that. This meant that the murder wasn't linked to the other two immediately. However, several hours later, the mutilated body of another woman was found just a few blocks away, leading to the theory that Elizabeth's killer had been disturbed by a man named Louis Dimschutz. He drove into the yard, put away his horse and cart, and his horse had shied from something in the darkness. But Louis couldn't see why. When he returned with a lantern, he discovered the crime scene. Investigators believed the Ripper had intended to mutilate her body, but at Louis's departure had fled the scene.
Wow, interesting. I guess, like we said earlier, it's very interesting that all three of these women so far have been married, have had kids, and their marriages haven't worked out for whatever reason, and they've turned to prostitution to supplement the income that they were getting from other lines of work, and that she was then killed, and potentially her killer interrupted by this random guy on his horse, interrupted the killer. It's interesting when you look at the next woman, Catherine Eddowes, you kind of see the result of this interruption. But it's just very interesting. I mean, we're this close to Jack the Ripper being caught in the act, which is fascinating.
It was the fact that the next murder was just a few streets away as well, which is why they're so obviously linked. So Catherine Eddowes was born in 1842, and she moved across England a few times before moving to London with her boyfriend, Thomas Conway, with whom she had 3 children. By 1880, she had abandoned her family, taken to drink, and was living with a new partner in a common lodging house. So a common lodging house is when you pay a small fee and as many people as they can basically fit will have a bed in this house.
Right.
And these were very common in Whitechapel, which fits in with what you were saying about the poverty and the style of life that they were having there.
Right.
So Catherine had picked up odd jobs to make money, and she'd turned to casual prostitution to support her alcohol habit. After being picked up by the police for public drunkenness on the 29th of September in 1888, she was released from jail at 1:30 a.m. and told to go home. Instead of going back to where she was staying, she headed towards the church, a popular location for prostitutes to pick up clients. At 1:45, Catherine's heavily mutilated body was discovered by PC Edward Watkins, doing his rounds in the area. The brutality of her murder and assault was shocking and far surpassed what the killer had done to the previous 3 victims. It was believed by investigators that the Ripper, having been interrupted during his previous kill, took his anger and frustration out on Catherine. The swift, skillful removal of her organs in a dark alleyway led investigators to theorize that the killer had some sort of medical or anatomical knowledge. However, the shocking state of Catherine's mutilated corpse would be outdone by the next and final Ripper victim, or at least final in the sense of the 5 that we've decided to focus on today.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess that's what I was talking about we'll see the result of this interruption, that this lady Catherine was so brutally mutilated in her murder that like you said, it seems that the Ripper took out his frustration of being interrupted, and also potentially he just wanted to finish the job. Whether this was, we'll talk about this later when we talk about the suspects, but whatever his motivation was for committing these murders, it seems unfinished in the murder directly before Catherine, and he just needed to finish it with the murder of Catherine, which is very interesting.
So we'll go on to our final victim now, Mary Jane Kelly. So Mary Jane Kelly's life is not well documented, but she was likely born somewhere in 1863 in Ireland. Her coal miner husband was killed in 1879, and it is believed that Mary Jane took up prostitution to support herself. Again, this is a theme across all the women. She moved to London in 1884 and found work in an upmarket brothel in London's West End. But by 1888, she was working the streets of Whitechapel and living with her then boyfriend, Joseph Barnett. Mary Jane was heard singing in her room in the lodging house on notoriously dangerous Miller's Court by fellow lodger Mary Ann Cox at 1 a.m. in the morning of the 9th of November, 1888. Mary Ann reported hearing and seeing nothing unusual for the rest of the evening. Around 10:45 a.m., Thomas Bauer, assistant to the landlord, went to Mary Jane's door to collect her rent. When she didn't answer, he walked outside and looked through the window, finding her horrifically mutilated body on the bed. Her skin and myriad body parts had been removed and scattered throughout the entire room.
Gosh.
Investigators believe that this is because Mary Jane was the Ripper's first victim to be killed inside, which meant he could take his time to do whatever he wanted without fear of being discovered.
Wow. Gosh.